Hi there and welcome to part 2 of my deep dive into what Miss Letby actually said on the witness stand during her original trial. We pick things up at the point where she's being asked leading questions by her defense counsel in order to educate the jurors on the electronic system nurses use to input clinical notes retrospectively and the use of contemporaneous rough notes as aid to memory. Each of the, I believe, 4 nursery rooms have their own input terminals. Those terminals are, however, located in the corridor outside the room, except in the case of room 1, the intensive care room with the sickest babies, where the terminal is actually inside the room for obvious reasons. Miss Letby gives information that to remember what had happened through the course of a shift for a baby, these retrospective electronic notes would be compiled from a mixture of documents generated during the shift and notes she had handwritten on the back of her own handover sheet. She states that, ideally, such non-official handwritten notes would be disposed of in confidential waste before going home, but her own practice was to keep the handover sheets in her pocket, resulting in her taking them home. Ben Myers at this point goes off into other matters, only returning to the handover sheets, implicitly seeking to address their role in the prosecution case at the end of this part of Miss Letby's testimony around the non-medical sides of the case created against her. When he does get back to the handover sheets, there is an important point to be made which, to my knowledge, has been made neither by the media, no surprise there, or anywhere else to date. If you are pushed to time or find the content here tepid stuff already in your knowledge, just fast forward to the final 5 to 7 minutes where I will seek to make that point. As stated, having introduced the handover sheets, Benjamin Myers moves on to other records, seeking to cover the occasionally missing required nurse initials against each reading entered on a baby's observation chart. I quote report. Letby adds that for each observation, ideally, it would be signed off with the nurse's initials. In the reality of a busy shift, it happens to everybody that an initial signature could be occasionally left off the bottom of the observation chart. End report quote. Miss Letby then repeatedly confirms that such occurrences were a commonplace and nothing sinister. Clarity is then given on the fact that the times given for an observation or a feed were only required to be approximate to the nearest quarter of an hour, and so recorded times do not necessarily support prosecution inferences. Prescription charts were the only exception, being required to be accurate to the minute. Reference the period June 2015 to June 2016, Miss Letby had this to say, I quote report. Letby says that time was much busier than previous years. We seem to have babies with a lot more complex needs. Letby says staffing levels were not changed to accommodate for this. Letby says they had not encountered a baby on that unit before with chest drain requirements or stomas or haemophilia as they did during June 2015 to June 2016. Letby says she would, quite often, do more shifts as overtime after being asked to do so than her typical monthly quota. She says, at times it could be very short notice, sometimes from lunchtime and being asked to cover that night. She says she would not know in advance which baby she would be caring for. Mr. Myers asks if it is possible to ask for a particular baby to care for. Letby says it's possible, usually to facilitate continuity of care. End report quote. I draw your attention to the fact that this defendant has explicitly cited staffing levels in her defense. She would not be saying this on the stand if it was not also in her prepared statement. But this judge has ruled as irrelevant the evidence of a formally commissioned review into the deaths, which explicitly identifies the same issue, staffing levels, as a factor in the deaths in its conclusions. Moving on, given the endless smearing of Miss Letby for her reactions to deaths and collapses by both the prosecution and the mainstream media, it is appropriate to document what she says on the subject in order to get a better idea of this aspect of the culture on the neonatal unit, so abused to give a spurious credence to the prosecution case. I quote report. It's a long one. Mr. Myers now refers to the babies in the case asking general questions. He asks about when there is a death on the unit. Letby says the death does have an impact on everyone on the unit, as it is a small unit. Everyone would have different reactions to it. She says there would be nothing formal as a means of support to deal with such instances, but there would be support among the colleagues. Messages would be exchanged among staff. There was no form of support and no formal structured assistance, the court hears. Lucy Letby says staff had to be professional and carry on in caring for the babies who were on the unit. For families, support on offer would come from nurses who had a bereavement guideline. Largely, it would be from the nurses. We would support them as much as we possibly can. The bereavement checklist was formal guidance, and that would include collecting memories for the family. It would normally be the designated nurse for that baby to compile such memories, Letby explains. A checklist is shown for child A. Lucy Letby's signature is present on the entries. She was the designated nurse. The checklist includes hand and footprints, a lock of hair taken, having religious support, taking photos, baby dressed in own clothes. The note includes a memory box, which would, Letby tells the court, be a box donated by neonatal charities and be a storage box for the hand footprints, a lock of hair, and a teddy bear, one for the baby, one for the family to keep. A staff debrief would be held, not always, and led by the consultant following the death of the baby on the unit. All staff would be invited to attend. It could be held days or weeks following the baby's death. Asked about the death of babies for staff personally, Letby says, "It was very upsetting. You don't forget things like that. They stay with you." End report quote. From that aspect of life on a neonatal unit, Ben Myers moves on to Miss Letby's life outside work. She gives information that her life was active, including salsa classes, going on holidays with friends, and even going to the gym. She gives the names of 5 colleagues forming her closest circle even, 4 nurses, 1, the doctor, her relationship with whom, from the questions put to her, must have been the basis of all that salacious speculation. She tells the court he came to the Countess as a registrar in 2015, and the friendship was a close one, with him visiting her at home and them going for walks, but was never more than a friendship. The friendship fizzled out in the early part of 2018, and in the years since, the doctor had moved on to pastures new. The matter of the Facebook searches is then covered. The use of phones was apparently acceptable anywhere at work except in the actual nursery rooms. I quote report. Letby is asked about how well staff could get to know families. Letby says those families could be there for several months. She agrees she would also get to know families of babies not on the indictment. She says she would not be the only nurse to keep in touch with families after they have been discharged. She agrees she has looked for parents on Facebook. Myers asks about her Facebook usage. I was always on my phone. Letby says she would look up many names out of curiosity, such as colleagues, people she had met at Salsa. There will be people who were just on my mind. End report quote. There is an agreed evidence document titled Facebook Searches by Lucy Letby, June 2015 to June 2016. It includes searches for parents related to the indictment, but on the same days of such searches, searches on the parents of non-indictment babies, searches on work colleagues, and non-work matters. This is what James Goss should have been throwing out as an irrelevant waste of court time, not the RCPCH report. On June 9, 2015, for example, Miss Letby searched for the mother of Child A and Child B, along with 3 social contacts, Hudson and Harkness from the unit, and a mother from Liverpool Women's Hospital, where she had last been 3 months before. Her search total for June 2015 was 113. However, there was duplication, as she was in the practice of searching for the same person more than once. The number of searches each month varied widely, dropping to a low of 70 for July of 2015, then more than doubling to 175 for August, and rising even further to 209 for September. It would be obvious, even to a fool, that there is no pattern between her Facebook searching and her wholly fabricated killing spree. October 2015 saw 173 searches, with the following month seeing the peak of Miss Letby's Facebook activity with 277, including 9 searches in 9 minutes at one point. 2 of those 9 searches related to mothers from Liverpool Women's Hospital, where she hadn't been in 8 months at that point. Of the 277 November 2015 searches, a grand total of 5, or less than 2%, related to parents from the indictment. Remember what I said about even a fool being able to see the absence of any connection between the items on the indictment, I can't even call them crimes, and her Facebook searching. For the record, her search activity for some of the remaining months is as follows: December 211, January 199, February 178, May 164, and June 2016 233. Those 233 searches did not include a single parent from the indictment. Benjamin Myers now moves on to the residential aspects of Miss Letby's life, eventually linking this directly to the indictment through the house search. When the court is shown a photo of the front of her house, including her car, she admits to finding the image a difficult one to look at. Who wouldn't in those circumstances? Images are then shown of the inside of the Westbourne Road house. Her bedroom is really a child's, with a duvet cover with "Sweet Dreams" emblazoned across it, and a host of cuddly toys of Winnie the Pooh and similar sitting on top of it. Unsurprisingly, she becomes tearful for the 4th or 5th time at the image of her bedroom after the police had turned it upside down looking for evidence to feed the false accusations of the consultants and justify the prejudices of Dewey Evans, whilst simultaneously masking his now universally recognized incompetence. How the jury could fail to see, or more accurately, act on this emotional evidence that this was simply an ordinary young woman somehow finding herself involuntarily plunged into a waking nightmare remains beyond me. That Judith Moritz even, must also have had a day off from reporting this particular day, most likely to go off and torment some other innocents for a change of pace. How else could she now be premising her red-top reader psychologist theory of Miss Letby's guilt on the basis of her not showing emotion? Miss Letby even becomes tearful at an image of a downstairs cupboard associated with her two rescue cats, Tigger and Smudge, because that was where she stored some kind of file of their vet records or something. The same cupboard also contained files with all the course material from her training as a nurse. As she's testified, she clearly had difficulty throwing paperwork out. She then gives further insight into just how normal and emotionally alive she is. I quote report. A further note is shown to the court featuring a lot of names. One of the names is Whiskey, the name of Letby's former pet dog. Mr. Myers, why are you writing these names over and over again? Letby, because they are important people to me and they were on my mind. At the time, I had a limited support network. The names include colleagues and the names of Letby's cats. Mr. Myers asks why there are different coloured inks on the note. Letby replies the note would have been added to at different times. Letby is asked about the word love, which is in a rectangle. Letby replies, "It was for the love of the people that were important to me." End report quote. Later, in response to the question as to why the name of what was obviously a non-indictment baby is featured in her diary, she states, I quote, "Something has stood out for that baby. It was for my own reflection." End quote. Could any father in that courtroom with experience of raising a daughter seriously maintain the belief that they were dealing with a cold-blooded baby killer? The same goes for any encountering these utterances at a later date. I really don't think so. Myers then questions Miss Letby on a crossed-out diary entry from sometime in 2016. I quote report. A crossed-out section is shown. Behind the crossed-out part, Mr. Myers tries to identify the words. "I don't know if I killed them. Maybe I did. Maybe all this is down to me." Letby agrees those are the words. Letby says this is how she was feeling at the time. She says crossing it out is just something she would do, a way of me processing and dealing with things. End report quote. All the withheld evidence, disinformation and manipulation notwithstanding, would I be being unfair to the jurors to say that, in the end, beyond reasonable doubt had been watered down to, well, it is possible she might have done it, in order to make their decision to convict? Just bear with me here. If Miss Letby was mentally fit to stand trial, compos mentis, to use a technical term, it follows that everything she said or did, which was relevant to their assessment of her guilt or innocence, merited the same assumption of rational conduct. That includes this diary entry, the purpose of which was to, in her own mind, explicitly address the possibility that she may have brought this situation onto herself by having inadvertently caused the deaths of the babies without ever realizing she had done so. That position is logically incompatible within the same rational mind with knowledge, or memories if you like, of having been a premeditated killer in the same events. What Miss Letby tells her diary here has to be taken at face value. In the asking of herself the question of whether she could be responsible, there is a necessary logical premise that she has no knowledge on that question. If her rationality in the indictment is accepted, as it is, then that absence of knowledge has to be taken at face value even. If you are in your right mind and you have no knowledge of something, that is sufficient evidence that you had no part in it. Certainly that you can't be held responsible for it. Thoughts shared with one's diary also have something of the veracity of the dying declaration about them. The imminent prospect of death is seen as the circumstance which most fully realizes our potential for honesty. Hence, deathbed confessions and the like carry a special force in legal proceedings. Similarly, as a diary is communicated with on the optimistic assumption that such communications will remain secret, the dishonesties which bedevil our communications with each other are not an issue. The only route for finding of guilt in this particular circumstance would be one involving a permanent diversion into insanity in relation to that guilt. That detour is never made in this trial, though. Therefore, the guilty verdict of the jury is premised on Miss Letby's rationality, while disregarding incontrovertible documented rational evidence that, even on the assumption that babies died as a result of Miss Letby's acts or omissions, there was absolutely no intent for wrongdoing, or even subsequent knowledge that wrongdoing or even error had taken place. There is therefore no scope for a conviction for murder or attempted murder in this circumstance. The more legal-minded out there might now be thinking, yes, but the judge didn't include that bit of Miss Letby's testimony in his summing up. The jurors might have forgotten. That's possible, but when you've sat there for 7 months trying to work out precisely whether or not this person is a murderer, I really do not see so obviously helpful a piece of information as something you are likely to forget. In what moral universe is that piece of insight into the mind of the defendant not a gift-wrapped reasonable doubt? In part 1 of this particular project, in talking about the so-called confessions in the post-it note, on which the media frenzy centered, of course, I drew attention to the fact of human explanations and mixed messaging, making the point that the mixed messaging necessarily diluted or balanced any apparently confessional statement. The difference with this particular statement is that what was tacit or only an inference from the relevant statements on the post-its, that she was not consciously engaged in any wrongdoing in relation to any death or collapse event, is explicit in this diary entry. I don't know if I killed them. Benjamin Myers then moves on to the handover sheets and the shredder. Right off the bat, I have to say that I am fairly confident in my own mind that Miss Letby had concealed motivation in relation to the handover sheets. It is the one area of her testimony which is counterintuitive and failed to resonate with me emotionally. It does not, however, follow that just because someone has a concealed motivation in relation to something, that said concealed motivation is pertinent to the basis of an adversary's ill will against that person in relation to that thing. That person's life will have facets unrelated to that which is the focus of the other person's ill will, and said concealed motivation can therefore relate to one of those instead. There is obviously more to Miss Letby as a person than the police's, the prosecution's, and finally the judge's self-servingly narrow, stripped-down caricature of malevolence. For what it's worth, My theory is this. In addition to being a compulsive hoarder, some of those sheets were kept for innocent sentimental reasons, as echoed by her reason given for the names of certain babies who the prosecution do not suggest she harmed being in her diary. Another reason I suspect was that some of those sheets might have, in her notes on the back, recorded professional milestones in relation to getting the opportunity to put into practice for the first time techniques she had been taught, and perhaps incidents where she might have been praised for her response or conduct. Don't forget that she just completed that intensive care course and gave information in evidence that the 2015 to 2016 period saw clinical experience of the likes of babies with chest drains, stomas and haemophilia at the Countess for the very first time in her more than 3 years of employment there. The information on the backs of those sheets therefore formed a ready source of reference for competency examples for future professional interviews for years to come. Ideally, that competency evidence would have been lifted from the backs of those sheets and recorded in a work diary. And while that may well have been the original intention, we cannot forget that this young nurse, in part because of a supportive and obliging nature, and in part because she was eyeing a mortgage, was working all the hours God sends. Certainly more hours than any other nurse on the unit. That work ethic, her mentoring, and that intensive care 6-month course all evidence a singular drive, so it is reasonable to assume that she was ambitious and had her eye on career progression. It would have been hard enough to make time to copy across those invaluable back of handover sheet notes if she'd only been working standard hours. With all the overtime, it would have been impossible, so I'm sure inertia set in as far as copying the information across, and she just resigned herself to simply keeping the originals rather, especially as she was given to keeping stuff anyway. Now, knowing she had harmed no babies, on first talking to police, Miss Letby would have had every expectation of things blowing over and her getting her job back. She'd already won a grievance. However, the fact coming out from the police investigation that she had, likely in common with every other nurse on the unit, been keeping handover sheets, even for wholly innocent purposes, would be something likely to do fatal collateral damage to her prospects of returning to the job she loved and had worked so hard for. Simply put, in such circumstances, the hospital would have been obliged to cover itself by standing on the disciplinary aspect regarding confidential information being in her home. I am guessing a recognition of this possibility of winning the battle only to lose the war was the reason she was not upfront about the reason or purpose for the sheets being in her possession from the very first police question about them. From that point she was, of course, painted into a corner. Coming clean about the sheets later, once it became clear that the nightmare wasn't going away and her freedom was in fact in jeopardy, would have made a suddenly perilous situation even more so. A white lie does not, however, make a person a serial killer, not least when there is no actual evidence of crime. The reality of all this is that it is a classic let he who is without sin cast the first stone scenario. That seems as good a place as any to pause. From here, Ben Myers took Miss Letby through the cases on the indictment, and that is where I will pick things up next time. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments section below, and as usual, thank you for watching, thank you for your time, and all the best.